Chapter 1. The scent of vervain and static. The air in the healing den always smelled the same. A comforting mix of dried vervain, crushed willow bark, and the clean scent of boiled linens. For Nala, it was the only smell that felt like peace. She pressed a cool poultice to the warrior's arm, her fingers moving with a practiced grace that belied the tremor deep in her bones. His gash was deep, a nasty slash from a border skirmish. Still, she worked with focus. And then it happened. The edges of her vision blurred just for a second. The vibrant green of the herbs on the table muted to a dull gray. A beat later, the low hum of conversation in the den faded, replaced by a strange, buzzing static in her ears. Her breath caught. Not now. Please, not now. She fought it, digging her nails into her own palm, the small, sharp pain a lifeline pulling her back from the edge of that quiet, empty abyss. The world snapped back into focus. Nala? Alara's voice was soft, laced with a familiar concern. The pack's elder healer stood beside her, her wise eyes missing nothing. Are you well, child? Nala forced a smile, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Just tired, Elder. The nights have been long. Truth be told, she didn't know what scared her more, the spells themselves, or someone finding out just how bad they'd gotten. Alara placed a wrinkled hand on her shoulder, a silent weight of understanding. Your mother used to get them, you know, the dizzy spells, but never like this. Before she could ask what like this meant, the flap of the den flew open. 2 more warriors strode in, their leather armor scuffed and their faces grim. They weren't injured, though. Instead, they spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Heard the Alpha held council, one muttered, his voice a low rumble. Kale challenged him again. In front of everyone, his companions scoffed. Kale has a death wish. This new Alpha. He's not like his father. He's cold, quiet. You never know what he's thinking. That's more dangerous than any beast. Nala's hands stilled. The mating ceremony was tonight, an event where the pack's raw power would be on full display, a crackling, overwhelming storm of energy. Deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't just a ceremony. For her, it was a test she was terrified she would fail. The thought sent another wave of static through her, stronger this time. Maybe it was fate, this feeling of dread. Maybe it was a warning. She didn't have an answer. She just knew that when the moon rose tonight, her entire world was on the verge of breaking. She finished tying the bandage, her movements now stiff. The warrior grunted his thanks and left, joining his comrades. Alara watched her, her brow furrowed. The moon calls to us all, Nala, but it calls to some souls more loudly than others. Be careful what you answer to. The elder's words hung in the air, a cryptic prophecy that did nothing to soothe the fear coiling in Nala's gut. To make things worse, a sharp, unfamiliar scent cut through the herbs, ozone and pine, a smell like a storm about to break. It was a scent of immense power, and it was getting closer. Chapter 2. The Ghost in the Alpha's Chair. Lewis sat at the head of the great stone table, the Alpha's chair cold and unyielding against his back. It still felt like his father's chair. It smelled of him. Old leather, stale blood, and a fury that had seeped into the very grain of the wood. The air in the council chamber was thick with unspoken challenges. It was a different kind of quiet from the healing den, a silence filled with the grinding of teeth and the simmering of ambition. The Crescent Fang pack encroaches on our eastern border, Kyle's voice boomed, shattering the stillness. He was built like a mountain, all brute force and swagger. Your father would have met them with fire and fang. He would have sent their heads back as a warning. Lewis kept his face a mask of calm, his hands steepled before him. He let the silence stretch, forcing every eye in the room onto him. My father's way left us with fewer warriors and more enemies. His way left our borders weak because he was too busy making new graves. The words were quiet. Yet, they landed like stones. Kale slammed a fist on the table. It was the way of strength. You offer them diplomacy, words. It's weakness. Is it? Lewis finally lifted his gaze, his eyes a flat, chilling gray. Or is it wisdom to let your enemy believe you are weak right before you cut the legs out from under them? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because of that, the threat in his tone was unmistakable. He had already sent a patrol to intercept the Crescent Fang's supply lines. They would be crippled without a single drop of Blood Moon blood being spilled. That was his way. Kale snarled, but he sat back down. His sister, Selena, watched the exchange from the shadows, her dark eyes glittering with an intelligence that far outstripped her brother's. She was the real threat. Lewis knew it. What he didn't know was what game she was playing. He felt a throbbing ache behind his eyes. It was a promise he'd made to his mother, on her deathbed, that haunted him. Be better than him, Lewis. Be the alpha he never was. He was trying. But the ghost of his father was a heavy one, and his primal wolf. It agreed with Kale. It yearned for the simplicity of a fight. He dismissed the council, the scraping of chairs a sound of temporary defeat. He needed air. He needed to get away from the scent of bloodlust and ambition. More importantly, he needed to get away from himself. The mating ceremony loomed, a political necessity he loathed. He was supposed to find his fated mate, his other half, the Luna who would solidify his rule. But what if the goddess paired him with someone like Selena? Or worse, someone weak who would crumble under the pressure? The thought was a cold weight in his chest. Without thinking, his feet carried him away from the war rooms and towards the one place in the compound his father had always ignored, the healing den. He just wanted a moment of peace. Chapter 3. A spark in the embers. Nala was arranging a bundle of moon petal herbs when the air shifted. The familiar scents of the den were suddenly overwhelmed by that smell from before. Ozone and a deep wild forest after a storm. It was a scent that commanded attention, that made the tiny hairs on her arms stand on end. Her body went rigid on instinct. She turned, and her breath caught. Alpha Lewis stood in the entrance, a silhouette against the bright afternoon light. He was taller than she'd imagined, with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe. The moment their eyes locked, the world outside the den seemed to vanish. The low hum of the compound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, it all faded into a roaring silence that was just for them. His eyes weren't the cold gray the warriors had described. They were a complex storm, swirling with shadows and a deep, unnerving stillness. He stepped inside, his presence a physical weight that pressed down on her. The static in her head buzzed, louder now, a frantic warning. Her wolf, a creature she rarely felt, stirred in its sleep. As if pulled by a string, her gaze dropped to his hands. They were strong, calloused, but his movements were controlled, deliberate. "You're the healer," he stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that vibrated right through her bones. She could only nod, her own voice trapped in her throat. He walked closer, his eyes scanning the shelves of herbs with an intensity that seemed out of place. He stopped before a small, locked box. "Shadowroot," he said, his gaze flicking back to hers. "It can be used to stop a heart, but in the right dose, it can also restart one. What's the catalyst?" The question was a test, sharp and unexpected. It broke through her paralysis. "Ashwinder venom," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "A single drop. Any more, and the blood boils." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes. In that moment, he let his guard down, just for a breath. And his alpha aura, the raw, untamed power that defined him, washed over her. It was like being hit by lightning. Her knees buckled. The world tilted violently, the shelves of herbs smearing into streaks of green and brown. The static roared, a deafening wave intent on pulling her under. No, 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 no. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek, the coppery taste of blood a shocking anchor. With every heartbeat, she fought. She pushed back against the encroaching darkness, her entire body trembling with the strain. The moment stretched, thick and suffocating. Lewis watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw her sway, saw the tremor in her hands, the sweat bead on her temple. But he didn't see the fight. He saw a healer who looked like she was about to faint at the mere presence of her alpha. He saw defiance in the way she clenched her jaw, mistaking her desperate struggle for insolence. And just like that, the fleeting warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a mask of cold disappointment. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the den, leaving her shaking in the sudden, echoing silence. The scent of his storm lingered, a promise of the chaos to come. Her heart ached. The mating ceremony was no longer a fear. It was a sentence. Chapter 4. A Name Like a Cage. The air was alive. It thrummed with a power that vibrated deep in Nala's bones, 1,000 heartbeats pounding in unison with the great hide drums. She tried to make herself small, a gray stone in a river of brightly colored silks and gleaming pelts. She focused on the smell of the ritual fire, pine and sage, trying to let it ground her. But then, the drumming stopped. A hush fell over the clearing, and he began to walk. Alpha Lewis moved with a coiled grace that was terrifying. He didn't stride. He flowed through the crowd, a predator in his own domain. With every step he took, the static in Nala's head grew louder, the world flickering at the edges. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner. He won't see me. He can't see me. He passed the daughters of the Betas, their faces masks of perfect, hopeful beauty. He moved past the warrior women, their shoulders back and their chins high. The pack held its breath. Instead of stopping, he kept coming. His path was a straight, undeniable line aimed directly at the quiet corner where the healers stood. To where she stood. From there, Nala saw something strange. Across the clearing, Selena, Kyle's sister, was watching, but her face held no hope, no anxiety. She had an expression of cold, calculating patience, as if she were watching the final piece of a puzzle fall into place. It was a look that made a new kind of fear, sharp and intelligent, cut through Nala's panic. The moment their eyes locked, time stood still. The clearing, the pack, the entire world narrowed to the space between them. His eyes were not just a storm tonight. They were the eye of the storm, a place of absolute, terrifying focus. He stopped before her. In the span of a breath, she felt it. A flash of a vision, hot and blinding. A great silver wolf howling over a shattered stone tablet. A promise broken. The image vanished as quickly as it came, leaving an echo of sorrow in its wake. He lifted a hand, not to touch her, but as if to command the very air she breathed. His voice was not a shout, but a low rumble that shook the earth, a sound meant not for ears, but for souls. Mine. The word wasn't spoken. It was unleashed. It slammed into her, a physical force that shattered her shields and ripped the air from her lungs. The bond, the faded connection she had dreaded, snapped into place not like a gentle click, but like a chain locking around her soul. As if fate demanded it, the power of his claim, multiplied by the focused will of 1,000 pack members, was a tidal wave. It crashed over her, and her world, which had been flickering and buzzing, simply ended. The roar of static became a soft, welcoming hum. The weight of her fear lifted. The last thing she saw was the shock in his stormy eyes. Then darkness. Gentle and complete. Chapter 5. The Sickness of Pride. Silence. 1,000 wolves, and the only sound was the crackle of the ceremonial fire. Lewis stood frozen, the warm, limp weight of the woman in his arms a catastrophic reality. She was nothing, a healer, a fragile thing who had shattered at the first touch of his power. And she was his. Humiliation, hot and acidic, burned its way up his throat. His wolf, on the other hand, was roaring. Mate, ours, protect. The beast raged against his shame, a primal instinct that cared nothing for politics or appearances. Without another word, he adjusted his hold, scooping her fully into his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her scent, vervain and a clean, unique sweetness, flooding his senses. He turned his back on the stunned whispers of his pack and strode towards his private lodge, each step a declaration of a failure he couldn't yet comprehend. As he moved through the crowd, he caught a glimpse of his father's old advisor, Tertian, giving Cale a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, an open loop of intrigue that his mind filed away, even through the haze of his fury. Inside his chambers, the silence was heavier. He gently laid her on the massive fur-covered bed. In the soft glow of the hearth fire, she looked even smaller, her face pale and her breathing even. A stranger. This was his Luna. This was the other half of his soul. His wolf purred, a low rumble in his chest. Safe, warm, good. But Lewis, the alpha, felt only cold dread. He saw the faint, crescent moon-shaped scar on her wrist, a mark that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite grasp. To make things worse, her eyes fluttered open moments later. They were a soft, hazy brown, filled with a confusion that quickly sharpened into horror. She sat up, clutching a fur to her chest. His own shame curdled into a cold, cruel anger. He needed to control this. He needed to put a wall between himself and the disaster she represented. "The goddess has cursed me," he said, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth it held just moments before. "With a broken Luna." Her face, already pale, lost all its remaining color. Her name hung in the air, a question she didn't dare ask. "You will be a mate in name only," he continued, the words like chips of ice. "A political necessity, nothing more. Stay here, stay out of sight." Without giving her a chance to respond, he turned his back on her. He needed to get away, to escape the scent of her, the sight of her, the catastrophic reality of their bond. He reached the heavy oak door, his hand closing around the iron handle. He felt a moment of grim, cold relief. He could fix this. He could manage this. He could contain her. He pulled the door open, and then the world tilted on its axis. Chapter 6. A Cage for Two. The first wave hit him before he even crossed the threshold. It wasn't a thought or an emotion. It was a physical, brutal assault. A wave of nausea so profound it made the room swim. After that, a grinding ache erupted in his bones, a deep cellular agony as if his entire skeleton were being twisted out of alignment. He stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe, a strangled gasp tearing from his throat. What was this? He took another step into the hallway away from her. The pain intensified tenfold. It was a fever fire licking at his veins, a phantom weight crushing his chest. His wolf howled in his mind, a sound of pure agony. Wrong! Go back! Bond breaking. Bond sickness. He'd read of it in the old lore, dismissed it as exaggerated myth. A pain that struck when a new, unconsummated bond was stretched too far. But the texts had described an ache, a discomfort. This was torture. The intensity was wrong, far worse than any book had ever mentioned. Why was their connection so violently powerful? Meanwhile, inside the room, Nala cried out. The same vicious, inexplicable pain had slammed into her. She curled into a ball on the bed, her body convulsing. She thought it was her curse, a new and terrible symptom of her brokenness, a punishment for failing so spectacularly. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. Lewis staggered back, every instinct screaming at him. Defeated, not by an enemy or a rival, but by his own magic, by his own soul, he was forced to turn around. He pushed himself back into the room, his body trembling with the effort. The moment he crossed the threshold, the pain vanished. Not faded, vanished. It left behind only a dull, residual throb and the echo of its ferocity. He stood there, breathing heavily, sweat beading on his brow. Across the chamber, he saw Nala push herself up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. She was looking at him, and he knew she had felt it too. He saw the same truth reflected in her terrified gaze. They were prisoners. He was a prisoner of his duty. She was a prisoner of her weakness. And now, the bond itself had become their shared cell. There was no escape. Not for either of them. The tension broke. With a finality that felt like a death sentence, Lewis reached back and shut the heavy door. The click of the latch echoed in the silent room, the sound of a key turning in a lock. He looked at her, his stormy eyes holding no warmth, only the grim acceptance of a fellow inmate. "Stay." His voice trembled, a command born not of authority, but of pure, desperate necessity. Chapter 7. The Space Between Heartbeats. Come morning, the world had shrunk to the four walls of the Alpha's lodge. Nala awoke on a thick pile of furs near the hearth, the fire having dwindled to glowing embers. She had refused the bed, a silent, pathetic protest that he hadn't even acknowledged. Across the massive room, Lewis was already awake. He wasn't dressed in the formal leathers of an alpha, but in simple dark trousers, his bare back a canvas of taut muscle as he stared into the dying flames. The silence wasn't empty. It was a living thing, thick and heavy with everything that had not been said. She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, trying not to make a sound. It was a useless effort. She felt his attention shift to her, a weight on her skin even though he didn't turn around. That's why the day passed in a series of these quiet, agonizing moments. Time stood still, measured only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. He paced, a restless storm contained by stone and wood, and she tried to make herself invisible, tucking herself into a corner with a book she couldn't read. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was worse than his anger. His anger was a hot, quick flame. This cold, suffocating silence was a slow death. A servant, a young she-wolf with wide, nervous eyes, brought a tray of food. She set it on the great table between them and practically fled, not even daring to meet the Alpha's eyes. Nala's stomach growled, a small, embarrassing betrayal. After a moment, Lewis took a plate and moved to the far side of the chamber. She did the same, and they ate, separated by a chasm of polished wood and unspoken resentment. From there, she watched him. No matter how hard she tried, her eyes kept drifting back to him. She saw the subtle tells of the war raging inside him, a muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hand clenched into a fist on the arm of his chair for no reason. Once, she saw a flicker of brilliant gold in his eyes, a flash of the captive wolf before he blinked it away. Maybe it was fate that she was a healer because she found herself diagnosing him. He wasn't just a cold, cruel alpha. He was a man in profound pain. Later, while he was distracted, her gaze fell upon the books on his personal table. They weren't scrolls of war strategy or territorial maps. They were old, leather-bound tomes of pack lore. One was left open, and she could just make out the elegant script on the page. It was a chapter heading, "On the Anomalies of the Primal Bond." Her breath caught. He wasn't just ignoring their situation. He was researching it. He was trying to understand the cage they were both trapped in. As the sky darkened, another servant approached the door, carrying firewood. The boy hesitated at the threshold, his knuckles raised to knock. Before he could, a low sound rumbled from Lewis's chest. A growl. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a 100-pound wolf warning another creature away from its territory. The servant froze, his eyes wide with terror, and then he simply dropped the wood and fled. The logs clattered on the stone steps, the sound echoing in the stillness that followed. Nala stared at Lewis. He hadn't moved. His eyes were still fixed on the fire. But the air around him simmered. The space between them burned. Her world tilted. The man was disappearing, and the wolf was taking his place. Chapter 8. The Wolf at the Gate. Lewis knew they couldn't stay hidden. A pack without a Luna was a body without a heart. A pack with a Luna who was rumored to be broken. That was a wound that would fester. It invited challenge. It bred dissent. His wolf, a restless beast pacing the confines of his mind, agreed for a different reason. Ours. Show them she is ours. Let them see who they answer to. The pride of the wolf was simpler than the pride of the man. He turned from the fire, his voice leaving no room for argument. We are going to the great hall for the midday meal. Get ready. Nala flinched, but she nodded, her silence a thin veil over the fear in her eyes. The fear was a scent that drove his wolf mad. It wanted to soothe her, to wrap her in its own power and protect her from the world. It wanted to protect her from him. What a damnable mess this was. Moments later, they walked. The journey to the Great Hall was the longest walk of Nala's life. With every step he took beside her, she could feel the stares. The whispers were like a physical touch, crawling over her skin. Lewis was a stone wall beside her, his face impassive, but she could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. As they entered the massive hall, a hush fell. It was the same silence from the ceremony, but this time it was filled with a different energy. Not shock, but morbid curiosity. They took their seats at the Alpha's table, a raised platform that felt more like a stage. Nala wished the ground would swallow her whole. Instead, Kyle approached. He sauntered towards the high table, a mug of mead in his hand, and a broad, mocking sneer on his face. He stopped right before them, his presence an open challenge. Alpha, he began, his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear. Good to see our new Luna is awake. We were worried she might nap through her first day of duties. Laughter, scattered and nervous, rippled through the hall. Nala froze, the insult a sharp, public slap. She felt Lewis go utterly still beside her. She could practically hear the snap of his control breaking. Before the words left his lips, his primal wolf took over. In the span of a breath, Lewis moved. He wasn't the cold, calculating alpha anymore. He was a blur of pure, predatory fury. He crossed the space between them and slammed Kale against a thick stone pillar. The impact sent a shockwave through the hall, silencing every whisper, every breath. One hand was wrapped around Kale's throat, lifting the bigger wolf a few inches off the ground. Lewis's eyes were no longer a stormy gray. They were solid gold, molten, blazing with a possessive rage that was terrifying to behold. A growl, a true guttural sound ripped from his chest. You will not speak to her. His voice was a serrated edge. Ever. The silence roared. The entire pack watched, frozen, as their new diplomatic alpha showed them the beast he kept chained inside. His beta, a steady wolf named Elias, rushed forward. Alpha! Lewis, that's enough! As if in a trance, Lewis slowly loosened his grip. Kale dropped to the floor, gasping for air. But as Nala watched, she saw the strangest thing. Kale, rubbing his bruised throat, had a flicker of triumph, not defeat, in his eyes. Across the room, his sister Selena watched the scene unfold, and a slow, satisfied smile touched her lips. This wasn't a random insult. This was a performance. And just like that, everything changed. It was a calculated move, and for some reason, they wanted the pack to see the monster inside their new alpha. Chapter 9. A Whisper of Blood. The walk back to the lodge was a blur. Nala's thoughts spun, a dizzying mix of terror and something else. Something she was ashamed to name. Lewis hadn't spoken a word since the confrontation. He simply escorted her back, the storm in him now a silent, simmering thundercloud. He had been terrifying. A monster. But the monster had protected her. Deep down, she knew the truth. That savage display had been for her. The thought was both frightening and strangely comforting. Her own wolf, that quiet passenger, had felt a spark of pride. Her chest ached with a confusion so deep it felt like grief. She was staring into the fire, trying to make sense of the man who was both her captor and her champion when the door burst open. It was a young healer, breathless and pale. "Luna," she panted, her eyes wide with panic. "It's Fendrel. He was brought in from the Northern Patrol. There's something wrong with the wound. It's black." Nala was on her feet without thinking. Fendrel. He was a kind warrior, one of the few who had ever offered her a friendly word. The need to do something, to be a healer instead of a prisoner, was an overwhelming urge. She followed the girl to the healing den, Lewis a silent, imposing shadow behind her. The den smelled of fear and blood. Fendrel was on a cot, his body shaking with fever. The gash on his leg was horrifying. It wasn't just a cut. It was ringed with black, necrotic flesh, and thin, dark veins spread from it like spider webs. "It resists every healing salve," Alara said, her face grim. Her instincts surged. Nala knelt beside him, ignoring the elder's warning. She placed her hands gently on the uninjured skin near the wound, closing her eyes and trying to feel the life force within him, the way she'd been taught. But she didn't just feel his life force. She felt the thing that was killing him. It was a cold, corrupting energy, a whisper of dark magic that clung to the injury like a parasite. The wave of his pain, his terror, and that unnatural cold was a brutal combination. Without warning, the world dissolved. Her body moved on instinct, slumping forward, but Lewis was there, a solid wall that caught her before she could fall. To him, she had simply fainted again. But she wasn't gone. She was elsewhere. A scarred face, a cruel sneer in the moonlight, blades gleaming with a thick black poison, the scent of pine and dying leaves, a rocky outcrop on the northern pass, hidden from the main trail. 5 of them, waiting. Their laughter was a sound of pure malice. She gasped, her eyes flying open. She was back in the den, leaning heavily against Lewis, his arms a cage of solid muscle around her. The vision was seared into her mind, clear as day. "Rogues," she breathed, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. "At the northern pass. They have more of that poison. They're waiting to ambush the next patrol." As the echo faded, she saw the struggle in his face, the instinctive doubt warring with the memory of her last vision, the one that had saved his men. Her heart skipped. She had just revealed her deepest secret, her most dangerous flaw, to the one man who had the power to destroy her with it. In the quiet that followed, she knew this was the real test. Would the Alpha who called her broken believe in the power of her curse? Chapter 10. The Weight of a Whisper. The scent of dark magic and Nala's lingering fear clung to him as he left the healing den. Lewis strode back to his lodge, his mind a battlefield. Her words echoed, a perfect, detailed account of a threat his senses couldn't detect. He sat in the Alpha's chair, the cold wood a familiar weight, and she stood before him, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale but her eyes resolute. She repeated it all. The scarred man's cruel smile, the 5 blades, the black poison, the hidden pass to the north. His wolf screamed in his head, a frantic, one-word howl. Believe her, believe her, believe her. But the Alpha, the man his father had forged in ice and suspicion, saw only the political chessboard. To act on this vision, from a mate the pack already saw as a curse, it was suicide. Yet the conviction in her gaze was a tangible thing. It was truth. What followed was a decision that felt like tearing himself in two. He called an emergency council. The air in the chamber was already hostile. He presented the intelligence, a carefully edited version. A source I trust has warned of a rogue ambush. North Pass. 5 men using a new poison. He deliberately left out the part about the vision. He omitted her. Kyle laughed, a short, barking sound of contempt. A source? What source? A squirrel chatter in the trees. A ghost story from a traveling merchant? He leaned forward, his bulk casting a long shadow. The Crescent Fangs are at our eastern border. This is clearly a diversion, a trick to make you split our forces and leave the East weak. Your father would have seen it in a heartbeat. To make things worse, Tertian, his father's old advisor, nodded gravely. The silver-haired wolf had an aura of unshakable logic. The risk is too great, Alpha. To move a patrol based on such thin intelligence would be strategically unsound. Kale's assessment, while crudely put, is the logical one. Lewis watched them, his face a mask of stone. He saw the subtle, triumphant glance that passed between Kale and his sister, Selena. They weren't just disagreeing. They were steering him, boxing him in. Truth be told, their argument made a cold, calculated sense, but it felt wrong. It felt like a lie wrapped in the skin of logic. The council murmured their agreement. They sided with the fear they understood over the mystery he presented. To them, it was simple. To Lewis, it felt like a trap tightening around him. He was being pushed to ignore her, to publicly declare her warning as meaningless. He looked at their faces, the suspicion, the doubt, the open scorn. Believing her would make him a fool. Disregarding her, that felt like a betrayal his own soul couldn't bear. The silence stretched. The weight of her whisper was heavier than the entire mountain they lived under. Chapter 11. The Taste of Ash. The council was dismissed. Lewis stood alone in the chamber, the arguments of his advisors echoing off the cold stone walls. They had all left, confident in their victory of logic over… what? A ghost story? A feeling? He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble a grounding sensation in a world that had tilted off its axis. His pride was a fortress, and it demanded he listen to his counsel. It demanded he lock Nala away and forget her mad ramblings. But then, he remembered her face, the absolute, unshakable certainty in her eyes. It hadn't been a plea. It had been a statement of fact. As if the world narrowed, he realized his wolf had been silent through the entire council meeting. It wasn't raging or arguing, it was waiting, trusting him to make the right choice. And just like that, everything changed. Elias, he said, his voice quiet but firm. His beta, who had been waiting silently by the door, straightened. Gather a 5-man patrol. You're most loyal. We're going for a ride. Tell no one else. Elias didn't question him. He simply nodded. That's why he was his beta. They rode north, the pounding of hooves a rhythm against the frantic beating of Lewis's own heart. The air grew colder as they climbed into the high passes. He pushed them hard, a desperate urgency fueling him. Every instinct he had, every fiber of his being, screamed that he was riding towards a truth he wasn't ready for. He was riding towards the moment that would define him. He signaled for them to halt just before the rocky outcrop she had described. It was exactly as she'd said, a perfect place for an ambush hidden from the main trail. As they dismounted, the scent hit him. Beneath the sharp scent of pine, there was something else. The faint, coppery tang of old blood and the sickly sweet smell of death. His heart skipped. They moved forward on foot, silent as shadows. And then they saw it. The tracks. 5 distinct sets of boot prints in the soft earth. A little further on, a recently doused campfire. Elias knelt, picking something up from the dirt. It was a small, crudely carved wooden token, the snarling fang of the Crescent Fang Pack. Kyle had been right about who, but wrong about where. Or had he? What followed was the final damning piece of evidence. A small discarded rag lay near the cold embers. Lewis picked it up. It was soaked in the same viscous black poison that was killing the warrior in the den. The world tilted. The air in his lungs turned to ash. She was right. She was right about all of it. Every single detail. The realization didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a sickness. A profound, soul-deep wave of shame that washed over him, leaving him hollow. He wasn't just an alpha who had been given bad advice, he was a fool. A blind, arrogant fool who had taken the most precious gift the goddess could offer, a fated mate, a true oracle. And he had called her broken. He had wounded her. He had shamed her. In his desperate attempt to not be his father, he had become something worse. Elias looked at him, his face grim. "What now, Alpha?" Lewis didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the path back to the compound. The political battle was over. The real one, the fight for his own soul, had just begun. Chapter 12. The Unmaking of an Alpha. Nala waited. The silence of the lodge had transformed from a heavy blanket to a cage of sharp, pointed needles. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, sent a fresh spike of anxiety through her. Did he go? Did he laugh at her as soon as she was gone? Had he locked her in here for good this time? The mad Luna who saw things that weren't there? Her thoughts spun, a whirlwind of hope and despair. She didn't know what scared her more, that he hadn't believed her or that he had, and was now riding into danger because of her. The door opened. Her breath caught. It was Lewis. He was covered in dust from the trail, his face grim, but it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs. The cold, calculating mask of the Alpha was gone, utterly gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded emotion so intense it was like looking into the heart of a storm. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw the truth. He knew. He shut the door behind him, the sound soft this time, not a declaration, but a request for privacy. He took one step towards her, then another. The space between them burned with a new kind of tension, no longer hostile, but thick with a fragile, terrifying vulnerability. He stopped right before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the scent of pine and horse and the cold mountain air. And then he did the unthinkable. As if the weight of his own crown had become too heavy to bear, the Alpha of the Blood Moon pack sank to one knee. The gesture was so shocking, so fundamentally wrong in the hierarchy of their world, that Nala took an involuntary step back. He reached out, not grabbing, but gently taking her hand. His touch was hesitant, his calloused fingers sending a jolt of warmth through her cold skin. His head was bowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the command of an Alpha. It was the broken whisper of a man. "I was wrong," he started, the words thick with a pain that had nothing to do with any physical wound. "Nala, I was a blind, arrogant fool, and I hurt you." Her name on his lips was an apology in itself. The words I said, they were born of fear, of pride. He finally lifted his head, and the raw shame in his eyes was a devastating sight. "They were the words of my father, not of your mate." Her heart skipped. He had never called himself that before. Her mate. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "But I am begging for it anyway." The tension broke. Something inside her, a wall she had built brick by painful brick, simply crumbled. This wasn't a political move. This wasn't a strategy. This was the truth. This was the unmaking of an Alpha, right before her eyes. Without thinking, she knelt in front of him, so they were face to face. Her free hand came up to cup his jaw, her touch feather-light. His skin was rough with stubble, warm and real. As her wolf stirred, she felt it, clear as day. He was hers, and she was his. Before the words left her lips, she leaned in and captured his, a kiss that wasn't about passion or desire, but about sealing a promise. It was about forgiveness. It was the taste of a new beginning, salty with tears she didn't realize she had shed. In the quiet that followed, she knew that the Alpha might have claimed her at the ceremony, but it was the man who had just earned her. Chapter 13. Whispers in the Dust. The morning after felt like the first day of a new world. The air in the lodge was different, no longer a suffocating cage, but a quiet, shared space. The tension that remained was a fragile thing, a delicate thread of hope and uncertainty that spun between them. Nala watched as Lewis built up the fire, his movements sure and steady. He was still her alpha, a creature of immense power, but she no longer felt like his prisoner. Something inside her shifted. She was his partner. After they ate, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "We can't fight what we don't understand. We need answers." Instead of locking her away, he led her from the lodge. They walked through the stone corridors of the compound, but this time he was a shield at her side, not a guard. He led her to a heavy, iron-banded door she had never seen before, a door tucked away in the shadows beneath the great hall. The Pack Archives. He pushed the door open, the sound of grinding stone echoing in the passage. A gust of air, smelling of dust and forgotten time, washed over them. Inside, shelves packed with ancient scrolls and leather-bound books stretched into the darkness. It was a tomb of knowledge. "My father ordered most of the older texts sealed," Lewis explained, his voice a murmur in the vast silence. "He called them distractions. Tales of old magic he thought would make the Pack weak." What he didn't say, what hung in the air between them, was that his father had been afraid. From there, they began their work. He would unroll a brittle scroll, and she would read the elegant, faded script, her healer's training making her a quick study of the old tongue. He was surprisingly gentle, asking her questions she had never dared to ask herself. "When it happens, the sleep, what do you feel before?" he asked, his gaze intent. "It's like static," she whispered, the confession feeling monumental. A buzzing sound that drowns out everything else, and then quiet. He nodded, absorbing her words not as a judge but as a scholar. With every scroll they unrolled, a strange thing happened. Her fear of him began to dissolve, replaced by a deep, resonant curiosity. In fact, she saw not just an alpha, but a lonely man burdened by a legacy he never wanted, a man who was just as lost as she was. As the hours passed, she noticed a pattern in the old texts. They found cryptic, repeated references to a silver bloodline, a lineage of wolves who could hear the goddess's whisper. The scrolls spoke of how this line was broken and hidden away during the bloody reign of a paranoid alpha centuries ago. An alpha who, like Lewis's father, had feared any power he could not personally control. By the time the light outside began to fade, Nala felt an inexplicable pull. Her eyes were drawn to a single, unadorned scroll case on a high shelf. It had no markings, no title. It was just a plain, dark wood cylinder. But something inside her, a deep primal instinct, recognized it. As if pulled by a string, she reached a hand towards it. "That one," she said, her own voice surprising her. Lewis looked from her face to the scroll. He didn't question her. He didn't hesitate. He simply reached up, his powerful form eclipsing the candlelight, and took it down. The old lock was fused with age. She watched as he wrapped his hands around it, his muscles bunching. With a sharp crack, the ancient wood and metal gave way, revealing the treasure that had been calling to her soul. Chapter 14. A Debt of Blood. Lewis held the single, perfectly preserved scroll in his hands. Unlike the others, which were brittle with age, this one felt almost alive, the parchment soft and supple. He slid the ribbon that held it closed, and a faint scent of pressed moon petal and old ink filled the dusty air. He unrolled it carefully on the table, the candlelight flickering over the elegant, flowing script. It was a journal, the personal record of a Luna from centuries past. Nala leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his, a touch that sent a jolt of warmth through him. Together, they began to read. The words of the Luna painted a vivid picture of a time when the Pack was guided by more than just an alpha's strength. She wrote of her sister, the last of the silver bloodline, an oracle who could step into the spirit realm, an oracle who would fall into a deep slumber to have her visions. A spirit sleeper. Lewis's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Nala, at the woman who thought she was broken, and saw the truth of her power laid bare in ancient ink. But then, the story turned darker. The Luna wrote of a chilling prophecy passed down through her bloodline. As if fate demanded it, the words seemed to lift off the page and burn themselves into his mind. When the blood moon is weakened from within, the sleeper will rise. The anchor she chooses will be her salvation or her doom. His blood ran cold. He was her anchor. He was the one who could save her or destroy her. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than his alpha title, heavier than his entire world. What's worse, the final entry was a scrawl of heartbreak and fear. The Luna wrote that her sister, the Oracle, had been fated to the ambitious young alpha of the Crescent Fang Pack, a powerful wolf named Marcus. But before the mating could be formalized, the Blood Moon Alpha, Lewis's own ancestor, had challenged Marcus. He had defeated him in a brutal duel, claiming not only victory, but Marcus's fated mate as a prize of war. And that prize, that stolen she-wolf, had a name. It was the name of his mother. The world narrowed to a single sickening point. Marcus, the rival alpha, the man funding the rogues and poisoning his warriors. This wasn't about territory. This wasn't about pack dominance. This was a vendetta, a blood debt nearly 2 centuries in the making. Marcus wasn't just attacking his pack. He was trying to reclaim the legacy, the power, the bloodline, the Oracle Luna, that he believed was stolen from him. Lewis looked at Nayla, truly looked at her, and saw her not just as his mate, but as the living embodiment of Marcus's obsession. The journal also mentioned that Marcus's pack had been dabbling in dark magic, trying to force visions, to create their own oracle. That's why the poison felt so wrong. It was a tool of corruption. And just like that, everything changed. His enemy's goal wasn't just to kill him anymore. It was to capture Nala, to take back the power his family had lost, to possess her. A low, guttural growl rose in his throat, a sound of pure, primal fury. Over his dead body. Chapter 15. The Unfurling of Power. They emerged from the archives into the torchlit main hall, the silence between them heavy with the weight of their discovery. The world Nala had woken up in that morning was gone. Now, every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every whisper a potential betrayal. Lewis was a different man, too. The quiet scholar from the archives had been replaced by the hunter. He walked beside her, a searing wall of protective energy, his hand resting on the small of her back, a constant, grounding pressure that both soothed and terrified her. As they stepped into the vastness of the hall, they walked into chaos. 2 warriors were in the center of the room, circling each other like wolves, their teeth bared and low growls rumbling in their chests. The air was thick with the scent of their rage. Pack members scrambled to get out of the way, creating a wide circle around the impending violence. "You dishonored my sister's name," one roared, his claws elongating. "She was a willing partner," the other snarled back, his shoulders bunching as his own wolf pressed forward. Nala saw Lewis tense, his body preparing to unleash the crushing force of his alpha command to stop the bloodshed. It was a brutal but effective tool, a hammer that smashed dissent into submission. But then, something inside her moved. It wasn't a thought. It was an instinct, an ancient power unfurling within her like a dormant flower blooming in the space of a breath. While her pulse raced, she felt a profound, inexplicable wave of calm wash through her own fear. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the Alpha's hammer was not the answer. What this moment needed was not force. It needed peace. Before Lewis could act, before anyone could stop her, she stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't command. Her voice was soft, yet it carried across the cavernous hall, cutting through the rage and the fear like a silver chime. "Enough." The word hung in the air, imbued with a power that had nothing to do with dominance. A palpable wave of pure, serene energy radiated out from her. It washed over the 2 furious warriors, and the effect was instantaneous. The snarls died in their throats, their claws retracted. They blinked, the murderous rage in their eyes dissolving into a dazed confusion, like men waking from a terrible nightmare. The entire hall fell silent, every wolf staring at her, their expressions shifting from alarm to a dazed, reverent awe. Across the room, Nala's eyes found Selena and the old advisor, Tertian. Selena's beautiful face was a mask of pure, venomous hatred. Tertian's was one of cold, calculating shock. They had seen. The enemy within the gates had just witnessed the full, undeniable truth of her power. In that moment, she knew there was no going back. She was no longer Nala the healer, the broken, cursed girl. She was the Oracle, and she had just announced herself to the world. Lewis came to stand beside her, his stormy eyes blazing not with shock but with a fierce, burning pride. He knew it too. The game had changed, and his Luna was now the most powerful and most endangered piece on the board. Chapter 16. The Breaking of the Shield. A fragile peace, the kind that comes before a storm, had settled over the Blood Moon Pack. Lewis stood with his beta, Elias, over a large map of their territory, planning defenses. He could feel Nala through the bond, a steady, warm presence across the compound as she organized the healers. It was a low, constant hum beneath his thoughts, a connection that had become as essential as breathing. He allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could weather this. And then, the horn blared. The sound ripped through the air, a single piercing note of warning. Attack. It was followed by a second blast from the west. The silence roared for a heartbeat, and then the world erupted into chaos. "Two fronts!" Elias yelled, his eyes wide. "It's a pincer movement!" Lewis's blood ran cold. The main gate was their strongest point. The western wall, on the other hand, was closest to the healing den. His wolf clawed at the inside of his chest, a frantic beast. "Go to her, mate!" But he was the alpha. His duty was to the pack. "Elias, take your best warriors. Hold the western wall at all costs. Do not let them break through," he commanded, his voice a harsh bark of authority. "I will hold the main gate." He hated the words. Each one felt like a betrayal. He was sending another man to protect his soul while he fought a battle of stone and steel. As he raced towards the main gate, the sounds of battle grew into a deafening symphony of snarling wolves and clashing metal. The enemy hit them with a ferocity he hadn't expected. At their head was the scarred rogue from Nala's vision, his eyes burning with a manic glee. He moved with a brutal efficiency, a whirlwind of death. Lewis met him head-on. The fight was a blur of fang and claw, but something was wrong. The scarred rogue was good, impossibly good, but he wasn't fighting to kill. He was fighting to occupy, to stall. Every time Lewis gained an advantage, the rogue would disengage, drawing him into another part of the fray. It was a calculated, brilliant strategy to keep the alpha pinned down, to keep him away from the real prize. To make things worse, their attack was too perfect. They knew where to strike, which defenses were weakest, how to draw their patrols thin. The betrayal wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a screaming, undeniable fact. Someone from the inside was guiding their blades. With every heartbeat, his anxiety for Nala grew into a choking, physical pain. He could feel her through the bond, a distant pulse of growing panic. She was in trouble. He was losing her. And this damned rogue just kept smiling, his blade a constant, frustrating barrier. He was a shield, breaking under a relentless assault, and the one thing he was meant to protect was on the other side of the war. Chapter 17. A Symphony of Pain. The den was no longer a place of healing. It was a house of pain. The wounded started as a trickle, then became a flood. Warriors she had known her whole life were carried in, their bodies torn and broken, their eyes wide with the shock of battle. The clean scent of vervain was drowned by the coppery stench of blood. Nala worked, her hands moving on autopilot. She stitched wounds, applied poultices, and whispered words of comfort she couldn't feel herself, because with her oracle senses now wide open, she couldn't just see the pain. She felt it, It was a nightmare. With every new warrior that was brought in, a fresh wave of agony crashed over her. It was a symphony of suffering, and she was its unwilling conductor. She felt the splintering of bone in one wolf's leg, the searing fire of a poisoned blade in another's gut. The fear was the worst part. It was a cold, greasy tide, the terror of young warriors who thought they were immortal now facing their own end. The static in her head came back, but it wasn't a buzz anymore. It was a roar, a chaotic chorus of 100 dying thoughts, 100 final prayers to a goddess who seemed to have gone silent. "It hurts, make it stop. My family, tell them. So cold." She stumbled back, pressing her hands to her temples, trying to block out the noise. Her own thoughts were being shredded, lost in the storm of other people's despair. Her power, her great gift, was turning on her. It was a weapon being used to tear her apart from the inside out. Through the cacophony, she could feel Lewis, a distant, frantic pulse through their bond. He was fighting, raging, his power a brilliant but fading star in a sky full of darkness. He was too far away. He couldn't help her. She was drowning. Amidst the chaos, her eyes caught a strange detail. She saw Tertian, the old advisor, not tending to the wounded or rallying defenses, but quietly directing 2 guards away from a small, unimportant storage tunnel near the back of the den. It was a place for old linens and broken equipment. Why was he protecting it? Or was he clearing a path? Before she could process the thought, a warrior on a nearby cot let out a final, shuddering breath. His life force extinguishing felt like a physical blow. The intensity of it triggered a flash vision. It wasn't of the battle. It was of a dark, circular chamber deep beneath the earth, the stones carved with strange, corrupting runes. A ritual circle. Waiting. She cried out, falling to her knees. Her head was a symphony of pain. Her heart was an echo of her mate's desperation. And her soul was a witness to a dark magic she couldn't comprehend. She was the oracle of the Blood Moon Pack, and she was utterly, completely, terrifyingly lost. Chapter 18. The Price of Salvation. Nala was on the floor, the stone cold against her skin. The den was a portrait of failure. The healers were overwhelmed, the warriors were dying. She could feel the tide of the battle turning against them, a slow, crushing defeat. Her pack was breaking. Her breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, the pain, the despair. She reached for the one point of light left in her world. Lewis. She pushed her consciousness through the bond, a desperate search for her anchor. She found him. He was a raging inferno of power and fury, but he was surrounded, trapped. He was an alpha fighting like a god, but even gods could be overwhelmed. He couldn't win. Not like this. They were being outmaneuvered, their pack being bled dry by 1,000 calculated cuts. They were going to lose. The despair was no longer a wave. It was an ocean, and it was pulling her under. In that moment of absolute, soul-crushing hopelessness, a terrible clarity pierced through the chaos. A single line of the prophecy echoed in the silence of her mind. The anchor she chooses will be her salvation, or her doom. She understood. She could use him, her anchor, to have a vision. She could see the battlefield, find the weakness in their enemy's attack. But a small vision, a glimpse like the one before, wouldn't be enough. To save them, she would need to see everything. She would have to see Marcus's entire strategy, the location of every traitor, every hidden threat. To do that, she would have to let go. Completely. She would have to dive into the spirit realm deeper than any oracle had ever dared to go, and as if the ancient magic in her blood was whispering the price to her, she knew what it would cost. It wasn't a memory of a song or a face. It was the foundation of her entire new world. The price for that kind of power, for that kind of salvation, was him. Not his life. Her memory of him. The memory of the storm in his eyes. The memory of his voice, broken and raw as he knelt before her. The memory of their first kiss, the taste of forgiveness and hope, the fragile, beautiful love that had just begun to bloom in the ruins of her life. That was the price. To save his future, she would have to erase their past. She would save him and he would become a stranger to her. He would be her mate, her alpha, but the man she had just found would be gone forever. The battle raged outside. The symphony of pain swirled around her. But in the quiet center of her own heart, the real war was fought and lost. Her world tilted. She looked towards the sounds of the main gate, towards him. She had to save them, which meant she had to lose him. In the quiet that followed, her choice was made. Chapter 19. The Last Memory. The world was a distant, roaring storm. Nala felt the cold stone beneath her knees, the tremors of the battle shaking the very foundations of the den. But inside her, a strange and terrible calm had settled. The chaos of the pack's pain had faded, replaced by the singular, silent clarity of her choice. She was no longer fighting the current. She was about to become the tide. She got to her feet, her movements steady. The other healers were a blur of motion around her, but she moved through them as if in a dream, finding a quiet, shadowed corner against the far wall. From there, she closed her eyes, and she reached for him. She pushed her consciousness through the bond, a silver thread seeking its anchor in a sea of fire and blood. She found him. And just for a moment, she allowed herself to feel it all, one last time. She didn't just feel his desperation. She wrapped herself in the memory of his strength. She let the memory of his grovel, the rough scrape of his jaw against her hand, fill her senses. She remembered the shock of his lips on hers, a kiss that had tasted like forgiveness and the promise of a new dawn. Her body moved on instinct. She held on to these precious, fragile things. She was saying goodbye to them. She was saying goodbye to the man who had knelt before her. "I love you," she thought, the words a silent prayer sent across the distance between them. "Be my salvation." And then, with a final, shuddering breath that felt like her soul leaving her body, she let go. She didn't fall into darkness. She rose into light. The buzzing static in her head vanished, replaced by a sound like 1,000 silver bells ringing at once. The physical world of the den, the pain, the fear, it all dissolved. She was pure consciousness, a single point of light in an endless shimmering sea, the spirit realm. As if summoned, the ancient ancestral spirit appeared before her, the one who had tested her before. It was a great wolf made of moonlight and stardust. But this time, it didn't challenge her. It didn't question her worthiness. In the echo of her silent prayer, the great wolf lowered its head. It was a gesture of profound, sorrowful respect. It was acknowledging her sacrifice. As the silver light of the realm began to swirl around her, pulling her deeper, a single fleeting thought remained. Would the bond be enough? When the vision was over, when her memories were gone, would that silver thread be strong enough to pull her back to the world at all? Or would she simply drift away, a forgotten ghost in a sea of light? She didn't have an answer. She just let the light take her, her last memory not one of fear, but of the storm in her alpha's eyes. Chapter 20. The Oracle's Sight. Lewis was going to die. He knew it with a cold, hard certainty. The scarred rogue was relentless, a whirlwind of poisoned steel, and 2 more rogues were closing in on his flank. He felt a wave of pure, unadulterated despair wash over him from Nala through the bond, and his heart shattered. He had failed. He had failed her. He had failed the pack. He braced himself for the final blow. But then, something shifted. The despair vanished, replaced by a serene, silent calm that was so profound it was unnerving. And then, his mind exploded. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a sound. It was light, a torrent of pure information, a flood of impossible knowledge that bypassed his senses and poured directly into his soul. The world of mud and blood and steel dissolved. He was no longer in his own body. He was a hawk, soaring high above the battlefield. He saw everything. Everything. He saw the entire battle laid out below him like a living map. He saw Elias's unit on the western wall, about to be overwhelmed by a hidden flanking group of rogues. He saw the archers concealed in the rocks above the old oak tree, picking off his warriors one by one. He saw the traitors, a dozen of his own wolves, subtly sabotaging the defense near the eastern gate, their faces clear as day. The vision plunged deeper. He flew through the stone of the earth itself, down into the darkness beneath the healing den. And he saw him, Marcus, standing in the center of a ritual circle, his hands raised, chanting in a forgotten tongue. Tertian, his father's most trusted advisor, stood at his side, a willing acolyte. They weren't just trying to win. They were performing a dark ritual to sever the Blood Moon Pack's connection to its ancestral lands, to its very magic. And the final piece of that ritual was the capture and sacrifice of the Oracle. As the truth unraveled, the hawk's sight became his own again. The vision snapped shut, leaving him back in his own body, the scarred rogue's blade screaming towards his throat. He moved, but it wasn't a desperate parry. It was a fluid, precise, and utterly certain motion. He knew the exact angle the blade would take. He knew the exact moment his opponent would overextend. He felt the hot, burning grief of her sacrifice. He felt the cold, diamond-hard rage of betrayal. He felt the impossible, perfect clarity of the Oracle's sight. And in that moment, Lewis was no longer just an alpha. He was a weapon, and he had just been aimed. Chapter 21. The Alpha's Gambit. The world moved in slow motion. The scarred rogue's blade, once a blur of deadly speed, now seemed to crawl through the air. Lewis saw not just the attack, but the 3 countermoves that would follow. He saw the opening the man didn't even know he was creating. Instead of blocking, Lewis stepped inside the arc of the swing, a move no sane warrior would make. His fist, wrapped in the raw power of his alpha nature, crashed into the rogue's temple. A single, brutal, and perfectly calculated blow. The man dropped like a stone, his attack unfinished. The other 2 rogues froze, their eyes wide with shock. In the stillness that followed, Lewis threw his head back and let out a roar. It was not a sound of rage, but of pure, absolute command. It cut through the din of battle, and every Blood Moon warrior, every rogue, every traitor, froze. "Elias!" His voice boomed, imbued with the Oracle's certainty. "Take your unit to the western ridge now. You have 30 seconds to flank the ambushers." His beta didn't hesitate. He rallied his men and disappeared into the trees. "Bren!" Lewis bellowed, pointing with his blade. "Fall back to the old oak. Archers in the rocks above you. Silence them." The warrior, who had been about to be pin-cushioned, stared in shock before scrambling to obey. One by one, he issued the impossible orders. He named the traitors near the eastern gate, and loyalists turned on them with furious howls. He directed warriors to weaknesses in the enemy line they couldn't possibly have seen. It was a masterful performance, a god playing a game of chess against mortals. The tide of the battle didn't just turn, it shattered. The rogues, their perfect, coordinated attack falling apart around them, were thrown into chaos. Ambushes were not only thwarted, but turned back on the ambushers. Their greatest strengths became their most glaring weaknesses. The pack, moments from breaking, surged with a renewed, ferocious hope. They moved with the certainty of a single, unified mind. His mind. Nala's mind. Within minutes, the battle at the main gate was over. The enemy wasn't just defeated, they were routed. The remaining rogues broke and fled into the forest, pursued by howling warriors. Victory. Swift. Absolute. Impossible. But Lewis felt no triumph. As his warriors raised their blades in a victory cry, his gaze was fixed on the ground, on the stone and earth that separated him from the healing den. He could feel the dark magic from the ritual below, a cold poison in the earth. The battle for his pack was won, but the real fight, the battle for his mate, had just begun. He had to get to Marcus. He had to get to her. He started to run. Chapter 22. To anchor a soul. Lewis ran. He burst through the hidden tunnel entrance behind the den, the oracle's sight a burning map in his mind. The passage was dark and smelled of damp earth and old sleeping stone. He followed it as it twisted down, ever deeper into the heart of the mountain. The air grew colder, thick with a corrupting magic that made his fur stand on end. He could feel Nala's life force, a faint, flickering candle in an overwhelming darkness. He emerged into the chamber. It was a cavern of living rock, the walls pulsating with a sickly purple light that emanated from a massive black crystal at its center. Marcus stood before it, his hands raised, chanting in a guttural tongue that grated on the soul. Tertian and 3 other traders, warriors Lewis had known his whole life, stood as guards, their faces blank, their eyes glowing with the same foul energy. And Nala was on a flat stone altar, still and pale, her body a conduit for the dark ritual. Thin, shadowy tendrils of energy snaked from the crystal, connecting to her, feeding on her power. "Alpha," Tertian said, his voice devoid of all warmth. "You are too late. The age of the oracle is over." Lewis didn't answer with words. He answered with action. He moved, a blur of shadow and fury. The first traitor fell before his blade even registered the attack. He was no longer just a wolf or a man, he was both, a perfect, seamless fusion of primal instinct and strategic thought. The lingering echo of Nala's sight gave him an edge that was more than supernatural. It was divine. He saw their attacks before they made them. He felt their fear before it registered on their faces. He dispatched the guards with a brutal, merciless efficiency, each movement a prayer for the woman on the altar. As the last traitor fell, he was left with only Marcus. The rival Alpha stopped his chanting, turning to face him. His eyes were black pits of ancient hatred. "You see?" Marcus hissed, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Your father stole my mate, but I will steal your pack's very soul. She is just an empty vessel now, a beautiful shell. Her sacrifice was for nothing." A wave of dark energy, pure despair and corruption, slammed into Lewis. It was a staggering blow, meant to cripple his spirit. But as the darkness washed over him, he anchored himself to a single unshakable truth: his love for her, the grovel, the kiss, the promise. With a roar that was both man and wolf, he charged through the magic. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. This wasn't the boy who had taken over his father's pack. This was an alpha forged in sacrifice and love, and he was more powerful than Marcus could have ever imagined. The fight was short and savage. Lewis's grief was a weapon. His guilt was a shield. He broke through Marcus's defenses, his hands closing around the man's throat. But killing him wasn't enough. Instead, he spun, hurling Marcus directly into the pulsating black crystal. The impact was catastrophic. The crystal shrieked, a sound of 1,000 tortured souls, and then it exploded, showering the cavern in a rain of dead, glassy fragments. The purple light died. The dark magic dissolved. The ritual was broken. In the sudden, ringing silence, Lewis's gaze snapped to the altar. Nala didn't move. Her chest wasn't rising. The candle of her life force had been snuffed out. Chapter 23. An echo in the quiet time stopped. The world was a silent, gray photograph. Lewis stood amidst the ruin of the chamber, the bodies of traitors forgotten, the defeated form of Marcus a meaningless shape on the floor. All he could see was her. Still. So terribly still on the cold stone altar. He took a step, then another. Each one was a lifetime of denial and prayer. No. Please. No. He reached her side, his hand trembling as he reached for her face. Her skin was cold. "Nala," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "Nala, please. Anchor to me. Come back." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and poured every ounce of his energy, his life force, his love, into the broken bond between them. He pleaded. He begged. He offered his own soul in exchange for hers. For an eternity, There was nothing. And then, a shuddering breath. Her chest rose, a tiny, miraculous movement. Her eyelids fluttered. After that, they opened. He stared down into her eyes, the soft, beautiful brown he had memorized, searching for the light of recognition, for the warmth he had just begun to earn. He found nothing. She looked at him not with love, not with fear, not even with hatred. She looked at him with the polite, distant confusion of a stranger. A flicker of primal knowledge was there. The bond, a thin, silver thread, told her he was her mate, her alpha. But the rich, vibrant tapestry of their shared moments was gone. It was a barren wasteland. "Alpha," she said, her voice a soft, hesitant rasp. She tried to sit up, and he was there, his hands gentle as he helped her. The touch felt like fire and ice. "It's Lewis," he choked out, the name feeling foreign on his own tongue. "Lewis," she repeated, the name holding no weight, no history, just a sound. He led her from the chamber of death, out of the darkness and back into the torchlit corridors of her home. As they walked, he could hear the sounds from above, the roar of celebration. His pack was victorious. They were cheering his name, celebrating the alpha who had saved them. He had saved them all, and he had lost everything. They reached their lodge. The great hall was filled with the joyous sounds of victory cries and songs. But inside their chambers, the silence was a tomb. She stood in the middle of the room, looking around at a place she had never truly seen before. He stood by the door, the loneliest wolf in the entire world. The victory felt like ash in his mouth. He had won the war for his pack. But as he looked at the stranger wearing his mate's face, he knew he had just started the most important battle of his life. Chapter 24. The second first kiss months passed. Nala's new world was a story someone else had written, and she was an actress who had forgotten all her lines. She would wake in the Alpha's lodge, a place that felt both strange and familiar, like a half-remembered dream. They told her she was a hero. They called her the Oracle. She would touch the faint crescent moon scar on her wrist and feel nothing. She knew she was the Luna, that the powerful, quiet Alpha was her mate, that she had done something incredible to save them. But the knowledge was a collection of facts without any feeling, a history lesson about a person she didn't know. Lewis, however, was not a fact. He was a presence, a constant, gentle, and profoundly sad presence. He kept his vow. He never pushed her. He never demanded anything. Instead, he showed her things. He would take her to the healing den, and her hands would remember the feel of crushing herbs, even if her mind did not. He would walk with her by the river and tell her a story about a grumpy alpha and a quiet healer who first met in a dusty archive. He didn't tell the stories to make her remember. He told them simply to share them, to give her back the pieces of her life one by one. And a funny thing happened. She began to fall in love, not with a memory, but with the man right in front of her. She fell in love with the way his stormy eyes would soften when he looked at her. She fell in love with his patience, with the deep rumbling laugh she managed to startle out of him one afternoon. She fell in love with the lonely, devoted wolf who was trying so hard to rebuild a world she had sacrificed. The night of the first winter moon arrived, the night of the marking ritual. He came to her, not with a command, but with a choice. "It is tradition," he said, his voice low, "but it is not a duty. It is a question." She knew what he was asking. Was she ready to bind herself to him, not by the ghost of a past fate, but by a conscious present choice? That night, she stood before the entire pack at the moonstone altar, the silver light bathing everything in an ethereal glow. Lewis stood before her, his heart in his eyes. He was not asking an oracle. He was asking her. Nala. And she smiled, a real, genuine smile. She nodded. He stepped forward, and the marking was not a savage claim, but a tender, reverent promise. A surge of warmth and light and pure, unadulterated love flooded her senses. sealing not a broken bond, but forging a new one. It felt right. It felt like coming home. When it was done, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt whole. As the pack howled their approval to the moon, she stepped closer to him and rested her head on his shoulder. An echo of a disastrous beginning, now remade into a perfect ending. She looked up at him, at this stranger who was the entire world, and whispered, "Hello." He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was their second first kiss, and it was not the taste of forgiveness or fate or a desperate beginning. It was the taste of forever.